They told me not to open my mouth. "Your time is over," one of them hissed across the polished table. That was how the meeting began, not with numbers or handshakes, but with a sentence that felt like a dismissal from life itself. The words hit harder than any boardroom insult I had ever endured. I was not a participant. I was furniture. A man stripped of relevance, reduced to silence by those who believed authority belonged only to the young and the arrogant. I sat at the far end of the conference table, my chair positioned deliberately away from the circle of power. Their voices echoed off the walls, quick, sharp, full of self-importance. Every glance toward me was the same, cold, impatient, as if my very breathing disrupted their rhythm. It wasn't just a command to stay quiet. It was a verdict that I had nothing left to contribute. One man leaned forward, his cufflinks flashing under the lights. "Let's not waste time with outdated opinions," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Another smirked, tapping his pen, whispering to his neighbor, "Why is he even here?" Their laughter, quiet and poisonous, spread around the table like smoke. I clenched my jaw, but I did not respond. Years in uniform had taught me the value of silence. But this was not the disciplined quiet of strategy. It was the silence of humiliation. They thought they had caged me with it. They did not know that silence can be sharper than steel. I felt the weight of betrayal settle on my shoulders. Men I had once mentored, men who now wore expensive suits and titles, had chosen to erase my presence, as if loyalty and years of sacrifice could be scrubbed out like chalk from a blackboard. My history, my voice, my dignity. They treated it all as clutter in the room. The meeting droned on. Contracts, profits, numbers. None of it carried weight compared to the sharp command that still rang in my ears. Sit down, keep quiet. Their arrogance was thick, their confidence unshaken by conscience. I could see it in their eyes. They believed I was finished, a relic dragged into the present against reason. But beneath their words, something burned inside me. Not anger, not yet. It was the quiet fire of a man who had been underestimated one too many times. I kept my eyes lowered, my hands folded, my mouth sealed shut. Let them believe they had silenced me. Let them believe I was nothing more than a shadow in their meeting. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is not a raised voice. It is the silence of a man who remembers who he really is and knows that the moment of recognition always comes. Friends, let me take a short pause here. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This way you're helping us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. Every word spoken around that table slid past me as if I were made of glass. Their discussions about profits and expansion plans moved forward like a current, carrying everyone else along while I remained stranded on the shore. I was not included, not acknowledged. I might as well have been invisible. The papers shuffled, the screens flickered with charts and graphs, yet none of it involved me. Their glances drifted over me the way one glances over a painting hung too long on a wall, seen but no longer noticed. The sting was not in their words, but in their deliberate omissions. My name was never spoken, my opinion never requested, as if my very silence was part of the agenda. A younger board member adjusted his tie, speaking loudly about strategy, puffed up with the arrogance of someone who believed he had built the very foundations he stood upon. I had seen that same arrogance before, years ago in recruits who thought discipline was unnecessary until the battlefield taught them otherwise. And here it was again, in tailored suits, disguised as confidence, but built on ignorance. It is a strange thing, to give your life to a path and then be told, without words, that your contribution has expired, as if years of decisions, sacrifices, and scars can suddenly become irrelevant. The weight of that disrespect pressed on me more heavily than the silence itself. Betrayal rarely shouts. It whispers in the way people stop seeing you, in the way they move forward without looking back to notice who made the ground steady for for their steps. Yet silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence carries a sharpness no voice could match. I had learned that in uniform. When the room went quiet, it was not emptiness but focus, not absence but strength. And as I sat there, ignored, dismissed, diminished, I realized that every insult they poured over me was gathering weight, not to crush me, but to crush them when the truth finally rose to the surface. My breathing slowed. I studied their faces, each one pretending to build the future, while standing on foundations they never acknowledged. Their disrespect was heavy, but I carried it like a soldier carries his pack, without complaint, step by step, waiting for the moment when the march ends, and the silence itself delivers the lesson words never could. Betrayal rarely comes with fire or fury. It does not always slam doors or spit curses across the room. More often, it enters softly, disguised as indifference, carried in the way people choose not to look at you, not to remember, not to care. That was the betrayal I felt in that meeting room. The men and women at the table had once stood beside me, calling me partner, mentor, leader. We had faced crises together, moments where the company nearly crumbled under the weight of bad deals and market storms. In those nights, it was my phone that rang first, my presence they sought, my judgment they trusted when they were paralyzed by fear. And yet, as I sat in that chair, I saw nothing of that history reflected in their eyes. Their betrayal was quiet but merciless. To them, I had become unnecessary weight, a remnant of another era, a figurehead best left in the shadows. They smiled politely, but the smiles carried no warmth. They addressed one another with deference, but when their gaze fell on me, it passed as if over an empty chair. They had not forgotten who I was. Forgetting would have been mercy. They remembered, but they chose to bury it. They chose to rewrite the past in which I had carried them, painting themselves as architects of triumphs they never built. I remembered every sacrifice they pretended not to see. The late hours when I stayed behind to finish work others abandoned halfway. The weekends I spent fighting through paperwork, contracts, numbers, while they sat with their families. The times I stood up for them in board meetings where their mistakes would have been exposed, taking the blows on my own shoulders so their reputations remained intact. And now, those very people spoke of progress and innovation as if the ground they stood on had not been laid by my sweat, my blood, my sleepless nights. That was the cruelest part of betrayal. It strips not only your dignity in the present, but also tries to erase the worth of your past. They were not mocking me with words. They did not need to. Their silence, their avoidance, their refusal to acknowledge my presence was louder than ridicule could ever be. I was not attacked, I was erased. And erasure is the deepest cut of all, because it leaves you shouting into a void where no one admits you ever mattered. I studied their faces as they debated numbers and strategies, their voices rising with false confidence. They believed themselves visionaries, yet I knew the truth. I had seen them falter, seen their fear when the walls were closing in, seen their trembling hands when decisions had to be made that could cost everything. I had been the one who steadied them, who turned chaos into order. Without me, their empire would never have survived its fragile beginnings. And now, in this room, I was nothing but a relic in their eyes. The betrayal did not strike me as sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like a knife pushed inch by inch into the flesh, never deep enough to kill at once, but enough to make every moment unbearable. Their betrayal had not happened today. It had been happening for years, in every meeting where my voice was drowned out, in every decision where I was left aside, in every success they celebrated without mentioning my name. Today was simply the moment I finally understood the depth of it. I sat in silence. But my silence was not weakness. It was a ledger. Every slight, every dismissal, every act of erasure was being recorded in the quiet of my heart. And though they believed they had buried me beneath their arrogance, I knew something they did not. Silence has weight, and when the time comes, silence will fall heavy on those who think they are free from consequence. In the middle of their careless chatter, The polished table in front of me seemed to dissolve, and for a moment I was no longer in that glass-walled conference room, but back in the raw simplicity of the barracks. I could smell the metallic tang of oil on weapons, the sharp bite of cold mornings when breath turned white in the air. The memories rose uninvited, pressing against the insult of the present like a shield against fire. They had told me to be silent, but I remembered a place where silence was not weakness. It was survival. It was discipline. It was respect. In the barracks, silence carried weight. A single command could cut through the air and every man would obey, not because of fear, but because of trust. There, my voice had mattered, and when I did not speak, that silence spoke louder still. A raised eyebrow in the middle of a drill was enough to bring a soldier to attention. A pause before delivering orders was enough to remind them that lives, not just numbers, hung in the balance. In those days, silence was a language of its own, one that men who had never faced a battlefield could never hope to understand. I remembered nights when the rain hammered against the tin roofs and men sat polishing their boots in weary quiet, waiting for dawn. I remembered standing before them, reading orders that would send some of them into danger, my voice steady even when my stomach clenched. I remembered the trust in their eyes, the unspoken contract that I would not abandon them, that their lives meant more than strategy or pride. There was no arrogance in those rooms, no men puffed up with titles they had not earned. There was only rank born from sacrifice, respect forged in sweat and scars. And now I sat in a meeting room full of polished shoes and expensive watches, men who dismissed me as if I were obsolete, as if the years of carrying responsibility had been erased. They had never understood the price of a title. To them, titles were printed on business cards, earned in universities, handed out by votes in a boardroom. To me, a title had been written in endurance, in mud, in blood, in the trust of men who would have followed me into fire. The contrast was unbearable. In the army, silence had been a strategy, a strength. Here, in this sterile room, they tried to make it into a prison. They confused obedience with irrelevance. They mistook humility for defeat. They thought stripping me of a voice could strip me of what I carried inside. But the truth is, once you have commanded men in the field, once you have stood responsible for lives under your care, no dismissal in a corporate room can undo that weight. Their betrayal hurt, but as I sat with those memories, I felt a steadiness return to me. They could reduce me to a shadow in this meeting, but I knew who I was. I had led when it mattered most. I had carried authority that was not given by applause or by vote, but by necessity, by survival. And I had not failed. So I let them continue their performance, speaking over one another, intoxicated with their illusions of power. I sat in silence, but my silence was not theirs. It was not the silence of erasure, but the silence of a man who knows he carries a history that no boardroom can erase. I was silent, but inside, the weight of duty was louder than all their empty voices. The meeting stretched on, thick with arrogance. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the sound of overlapping voices, executives interrupting each other, cutting sentences short, raising their tones in desperate attempts to dominate. Papers rustled, pens clicked, numbers were hurled like weapons across the polished table. Each man believed himself the sharpest, the indispensable visionary who carried the company forward. They fought for attention as if the room itself were a battlefield, though none of them had ever known the weight of real battle. I sat in the corner, pushed to the edge of the gathering like a forgotten relic, and let them perform their little war of egos. No one turned toward me, no one asked for my thought, and still I listened to every word. I watched the way they leaned forward, the way ambition gleamed in their eyes like fever. They spoke of contracts as though they were lifelines, of numbers as though they were victories, of risks as though courage was something you could measure on a spreadsheet. They were so loud in their self-importance that they did not notice the silence I carried, did not sense the quiet study of their weaknesses in my gaze. It was a spectacle of arrogance, Men who once trembled at the thought of failure now sitting back with smug certainty, pretending that the company had always been this secure, that they had never stood at the edge of collapse. They bickered about percentages as though destiny itself bent to their equations. Yet I remembered the nights when those same men had called me in panic, their voices shaking, begging for direction. They had long forgotten that fear, because success makes people arrogant, and arrogance makes them blind. The irony struck me like a cruel joke. They silenced me because they thought my words no longer carried value, but they were deaf to their own emptiness. Every boast, every interruption, every shallow declaration of vision, it revealed not strength, but insecurity dressed as authority. They fought to be the loudest because none of them possessed the quiet assurance of truth. I sat there, invisible by their choice, but my invisibility gave me power. I had no need to fight for dominance because dominance is not earned by volume. It is earned by presence, and presence cannot be erased, no matter how hard they tried to push me into the margins. Their arrogance was a tower built of glass, and as they argued, I could already see the cracks forming. They thought I was a ghost, fading away in the corner of the room, but in truth, I was the one who saw the whole battlefield. My silence was not emptiness. It was observation, patience, and strength gathering in the shadows. They did not know it yet, but the moment was coming when their noise would collapse under its own weight, and the man they tried to erase would be the only voice that mattered. The moment came not with thunder, but with a smirk. He was young, too young to know the weight of real responsibility, too young to understand what it costs to carry others on your back. His suit was crisp, his tie perfect, his confidence sharpened by years of being praised for things he had not yet earned. He leaned back in his chair, tilted his chin, and let the words slip out with the carelessness of someone who thought himself untouchable. Let the old men sit quietly. It was meant as a joke, perhaps, but the laughter that rippled around the table gave it power. The sound was not loud, but it was enough. A chuckle here, a smirk there. Colleagues who would not have dared speak such words themselves found safety in his arrogance. And in that moment, the betrayal that had been quietly suffocating me sharpened into something precise, a blade aimed not just at me, but at the life I had lived, the service I had given, the scars I carried invisibly under my clothes. His words pierced deeper than he could ever understand. To him, I was just an outdated figure taking up a chair, a body they were too polite to dismiss outright. But to me, his sneer struck at decades of sacrifice, the years of standing under a flag in rain and cold, the nights of giving orders that determined whether men lived or died, the burden of command that never left me even after I hung the uniform in a closet. He dismissed not only me, but every soldier who had trusted me, every moment of silence heavy with duty, every medal whose weight had pressed into my chest as both honor and grief. I looked at him, but he did not meet my eyes. He didn't need to. He thought he had already won by erasing me in front of others, by branding me obsolete. The others shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke up. Their silence was consent. Their unwillingness to defend me cut even deeper than the boy's arrogance. Betrayal, I had learned, is often not a single action, but a chain of silences, each one heavier than the last. I sat still, my hands folded on the table. My heart beat slowly, not with rage, but with the quiet discipline I had carried through battlefields and barracks. Anger would have been easy, a quick reply, a sharp rebuke. But I knew the truth. Words shouted in haste are forgotten, while silence carried with dignity becomes unforgettable. His arrogance was loud, but loudness is brittle. My silence was steady, and steady things do not break. Yet inside, memories swelled. I saw the faces of young men I had once commanded, boys his age, maybe younger, who had looked at me with respect, not because I demanded it, but because I had stood beside them when it mattered. They had never called me old. They had never laughed at the man who bore the responsibility of their lives. Their respect had not come from titles or polished words, but from sacrifice that left no room for arrogance. And now, sitting here, hearing his mockery, I realized the tragedy of this room. It was full of men who had forgotten what true respect looked like. The son's condescension was not just his alone. It was the symptom of a room that had chosen to forget its debts, to bury its history, to exalt noise over truth. He had spoken the words, but they all carried the guilt. They all let the knife twist deeper. And though I remained silent, though I appeared unmoved, the wound he left would not be mine to bear alone. Because sooner or later, the weight of such arrogance falls back on those who wield it. My heart pounded louder than the arguments bouncing across the polished table. Every voice, every interruption, every shallow boast seemed to dissolve beneath the steady rhythm inside my chest. It wasn't rage. Rage comes quickly, burns bright, and then dies. This was something heavier, slower, the kind of pressure that builds beneath stone until it either shatters or carves a canyon. I sat motionless, my face calm, my eyes lowered, but within me silence was boiling, not with helplessness, but with a strength they had forgotten how to recognize. They thought betrayal was silencing me, telling me to keep quiet, brushing me aside as irrelevant. But betrayal is deeper than that. True betrayal is not in the command to be silent. It is in the decision to forget the path I walked, to erase the years when I was the one carrying them, guiding them, protecting the ground they now claim as their own. That was the cruelty of it. Not that they told me I had no voice, but that they pretended I had never had one to begin with. As they spoke, I found myself drifting into the weight of memory. I remembered the cold mornings when soldiers stood at attention, waiting for me to speak. They never doubted my silence, because they knew it came from discipline, from calculation, from respect for the moment. Silence there was not weakness, it was strength, the gathering of focus before a storm. And now, in this room of tailored arrogance and shallow ambition, they mistook my silence for absence. They could not see that silence is often the prelude to the loudest truth. My pulse pressed harder, echoing like distant drums. I studied each of them, how their hands trembled slightly when the debate grew tense, how their voices cracked when challenged, how quickly they tried to cover insecurity with noise. They did not know it, but their arrogance betrayed them. In their attempts to bury me, they revealed themselves. Their noise was desperation dressed as power, and I saw through every thread of it. The boiling point was not anger exploding, but clarity settling in. I realized I did not need to fight for a place at their table. I had already carved my place in history, with sacrifices none of them could erase. My path was written in scars, in service, in the unshakable dignity of knowing who I was. They could forget my name in this room, but they could never undo the weight of the life I had lived. The silence inside me grew denser, sharper. It filled every corner of my being until I felt taller without moving, stronger without speaking. They looked past me as if I were not there, but I knew, sooner or later, the balance always shifts. Arrogance always folds under its own weight. And when it did, my silence would not be weakness, it would be judgment. The door opened, and in an instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. The voices that had been clawing over each other a moment ago died mid-sentence, like a storm suddenly cut off by a wall of silence. Every pen stilled, every posture stiffened. The air grew heavier, and I felt it ripple through the room, the weight of authority that needed no introduction. He stepped inside, the CEO, and though he said nothing at first, his presence was louder than any of their bickering. His footsteps echoed against the polished floor as he crossed the threshold. Slow, deliberate, Each strike of his heel seemed to hammer arrogance into the ground. Men who had minutes earlier shouted over one another now shifted nervously in their chairs, as though they had been caught misbehaving in front of a parent they feared and respected all at once. The same faces that had sneered at me now adjusted their ties, straightened their papers, and fixed their expressions into masks of professionalism. I sat still in my corner, watching. To me, he was not simply a CEO. I remembered the first day he entered this company, years ago, still unpolished, his confidence not yet hardened into command. I had been there when he stumbled, when he sought guidance, when he learned what it meant to carry the burden of leadership. I had watched him grow into this authority, into this man whose very silence could calm or unsettle a room. And now, standing before the board, he embodied everything these arrogant voices were not: discipline, respect, and power that did not need to shout. The quiet stretched, thick and unyielding. He set his folder down on the table and did not rush to speak. That restraint alone forced every person in the room to confront the noise they had made in his absence. It was almost painful, the way silence carved into them, exposing their shallowness. For a fleeting moment, I thought of the barracks again, those nights when men would fall silent at the approach of a commanding officer, not from fear but from recognition of authority earned. This was the same silence, the kind that reminds men of their place. And still I sat, invisible in their eyes, yet feeling the heat of something inevitable. He had not looked at me yet. His gaze swept the room, taking in each face, weighing each man without words. The tension was unbearable for them, but for me it was a familiar rhythm. I knew this silence. I had lived it before. I knew it was the kind of silence that precedes revelation, the kind that cannot be interrupted without consequence. The CEO's arrival was not just an interruption to their arrogance. It was a reckoning. His very presence exposed the fragility of the room, the futility of their noise. And though they had erased me moments before, though they had dismissed me as irrelevant, I could feel the balance shifting. They had built their tower of pride high, but one word from him could topple it. I remained still, breathing quietly, my heart steady now. The boiling silence within me merged with the silence he had brought into the room. Together they pressed down on every arrogant voice, silencing them more effectively than any argument ever could. The moment had come. The arrogance had met its limit, and authority had entered the room. His eyes moved slowly across the table, steady and unhurried, as though he was measuring each man not by what he said, but by what he carried inside. One by one, the executives straightened their backs, eager to be noticed, to earn a flicker of his acknowledgement. But when his gaze reached me, it did not move on. It stopped, fixed with the quiet weight of recognition that no one else in that room could understand. The silence thickened, expectant, and then he spoke. Just one word, nothing more. Colonel. The word cut through the air like a blade, not shouted, not emphasized, but spoken with such certainty that it rearranged the atmosphere itself. The room shifted. I felt it. Everyone did. The arrogance, the noise, the dismissive laughter from minutes ago. Gone, shattered by a single syllable that reminded them of something they had chosen to forget. I was not simply a man in a chair. I was a man forged in duty, tempered by service, defined by a title that carried more weight than all their boardroom debates combined. The air seemed to grow heavier as the meaning of that word settled over the table. Some of them blinked in surprise. Others froze, caught between disbelief and shame. The young one, the one who had mocked me, who had sneered about old men, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk dissolving into something pale and unsteady. He had thrown words like stones at me, but now a single word, spoken by the only voice that mattered in that room, had turned them back on him. Colonel. It wasn't just a title, it was a lifetime condensed into one recognition. It was every dawn I had stood at attention. Every night I had carried responsibility heavier than my own survival. Every scar and sacrifice I had worn without complaint. In that moment, the boardroom became silent not because they chose silence, but because they had been forced to feel the weight of respect they had abandoned. I did not move. I did not bow my head or straighten my shoulders, though part of me wanted to. I simply sat, the word echoing in me, not as a memory, but as a living truth. They had tried to erase me, to turn me into a shadow, to strip me of relevance. And with one word, he restored everything they had stolen. It was not his gift, it was mine, but he had reminded them of it. The room was no longer the same. I could feel their eyes on me, eyes that avoided me before now, searching, recalculating, remembering. The man they had tried to bury under silence had been brought back into the light, not with arguments or pleas, but with recognition that no one could deny. And it was not just recognition, it was judgment. The word had exposed them, left them naked in their arrogance, revealed the betrayal for what it was. I remained still, but inside I felt a shift, the calm surge of justice returning, not with noise, not with vengeance, but with truth. Colonel. That word did not need to be explained. It carried its own history, its own gravity, its own undeniable power. They could no longer pretend not to see me. They could no longer dismiss me. The silence that followed was not mine anymore. It was theirs. The word still hung in the air, vibrating like a struck bell when the room shifted. A moment ago, their eyes had been filled with dismissal, narrowed in irritation, dripping with condescension. Now those same eyes widened, blinking as if they had been forced to see something too bright, too undeniable. In an instant, the faces that had mocked me, that had turned away as if I were a shadow, now carried something else: shock, recognition, shame. It was almost physical, the way the atmosphere changed. A tremor passed through the boardroom, subtle but unmistakable, as if every man and woman seated at that polished table felt the floor tilt beneath them. Their arrogance had been built on the belief that I was nothing but a leftover, a relic. But with one word, the illusion cracked. The CEO had pulled away the curtain, and they saw me not as the silent ghost in the corner, but as a man whose life carried weight they could never touch. The young one, the arrogant son with his smirk, was the first to falter. His lips parted slightly as though he meant to speak, but no words came. He looked at me with something raw in his eyes, confusion, maybe even fear. He had mocked me in ignorance, but now he realized he had spoken against more than an old man. He had spat on years of service, on sacrifice, on a title that carried not just respect, but history carved in blood and discipline. The shame on his face was almost unbearable to watch, though he tried to mask it by glancing down at his papers, his hands trembling slightly. Others followed. Men who had laughed quietly behind their hands now shifted in their seats, their polished confidence unraveling. They adjusted their ties, shuffled their notes, suddenly desperate to appear composed, though the truth had already pierced them. Their silence was no longer my silence, it was theirs, the silence of guilt, of recognition, of arrogance exposed. For years they had chosen to forget, to pretend that my place in this company had been trivial, accidental, undeserved. But now the reminder had come, sharp and inescapable, from the one voice none of them could argue against. I felt their stares on me, heavy and searching. They were no longer looking past me, no longer seeing emptiness in the chair I occupied. They were seeing a man who had lived a life none of them could comprehend. They were seeing the weight of years in uniform, the discipline that had shaped me, the honor that had followed me even when they had turned away. They were seeing the Colonel, not as a memory, but as a truth that stood in front of them still. And in that moment, I realized something important. I had not needed to fight them, had not needed to shout or demand recognition. The truth had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to break through their arrogance. Their shock was not just about my title. It was about the realization that they had betrayed a man whose life was built on principles far greater than their ambition. They had dismissed me as irrelevant, and now they saw how small that dismissal made them, not me. The silence pressed down harder, thick with unease. No one dared to interrupt. No one dared to move too quickly. The room that had been boiling with noise only minutes before was now frozen in the gravity of one word. And though I sat still, though I said nothing, I knew the balance had shifted. Their power had been shattered, not by argument, not by force, but by recognition. And recognition, once given, cannot be taken back. I did not move, did not open my mouth, but in that room my name had already been spoken for me. It echoed without sound, carried not by my lips but by the weight of the title that had been given voice. Colonel. It hung above me like a banner no hand could pull down. I sat still, but I felt taller, as if the years they had tried to erase were suddenly restored, standing behind me like silent soldiers, filling the room with their presence. My past had become my voice, louder than the shuffling of papers, louder than the contracts and projections they clung to as proof of their worth. Numbers could not compete with history. I watched them with quiet clarity. Men who had once leaned on my guidance now sat stiff, their eyes darting toward me with unease, suddenly reminded of debts they had never repaid. Their faces betrayed them, their arrogance was cracked, their confidence splintered. They had thought me irrelevant, a shadow fading in the corner. But shadows lengthen when light shifts, and in that moment, their own silence illuminated me. They had tried to bury me in obscurity, but respect, once awakened, rises like something elemental, unstoppable. Dignity is not something you demand. It is not earned by noise or bought with titles on a business card. True dignity is carried quietly, forged in moments of sacrifice when no one is watching, in decisions that break you but do not corrupt you, in years of endurance that leave scars the world may never see. That dignity had never left me. It had only been ignored. And now, in the silence that followed one word, it returned with force. It filled me not with pride, but with calm. The room could not take its eyes from me now. Not because I had raised my voice, not because I had forced their attention, but because dignity does not need to plead. It commands by existing. Every second of silence reminded them of the truth they had denied, that I was not a relic, not a mistake, not a man to be hidden at the end of the table. I was the foundation on which their very chairs stood. The CEO said nothing more. He didn't need to. His recognition had been enough, and the silence that followed was my answer. I did not need to lean forward, did not need to explain who I was or what I had done. My history spoke louder than any speech. My presence weighed more than their projections. My stillness cut deeper than their arguments. I thought of the years they had chosen to forget, the sleepless nights, the decisions that had cost me parts of myself, the loyalty I had given freely. They had treated that loyalty as disposable, but in this moment they were forced to remember that such things cannot be erased. They could bury me in silence, but dignity rises through the cracks, and now it had returned, not as a plea for validation, but as a judgment on their arrogance. I sat there, calm and unshaken, and for the first time since the meeting began, I felt no weight pressing me down. The burden of betrayal no longer suffocated me, because dignity had reclaimed its place at the table. And though I had spoken no words, the room itself carried my voice, firm, undeniable, impossible to silence again. Power shifted in the room, not with a declaration, not with a vote, but in silence so heavy it pressed into every corner. The same men who only minutes before had snapped at me to stay quiet now found themselves restless in their chairs, fidgeting with pens, straightening papers that did not need straightening, adjusting ties that suddenly felt too tight. They tried to meet my eyes, perhaps to measure my reaction, but none of them could hold the gaze. Their confidence, once so loud, melted beneath the weight of recognition that had returned to me, and in that collapse their power dissolved. I did not move. That was enough. The stillness in my body became a mirror, and they saw themselves reflected in it. Not as the masters of this company, but as men who had forgotten gratitude, who had traded respect for arrogance, who had betrayed the foundation that had once kept them standing. Their silence was no longer a weapon against me. It was a confession. It told me everything, that they regretted, that they feared, that deep inside they knew how shameful their dismissal had been. It is a strange thing to watch dignity return to its rightful place. It does not shout, it does not need to strike. It simply stands, and in standing it forces others to bow without command. That was what I felt in that moment. Their voices had been weapons, but weapons become useless in the presence of truth. They had tried to bury me under their noise, but truth is not soil, it is stone. Their arrogance broke against it, while my silence remained unshaken. The young one, the son with his mocking smile, sat rigid now. He had become smaller, not in size, but in spirit. A man who thought himself untouchable was suddenly stripped bare, forced to realize that respect cannot be stolen. It must be earned, and it cannot be taken from someone who has already bled for it. His earlier words echoed back to him, poisoned now, and the weight of his condescension was a burden on his shoulders that no one could remove. He looked down, unable to face the truth that had entered the room with a single word. I could feel it in the air, the balance tilting. Minutes ago, they had been certain I was irrelevant, a ghost haunting the edge of their empire. Now they looked at me differently, not as a relic, not as a forgotten name, but as someone they could not erase. Respect had returned, not because they chose to give it, but because it had always been mine. They had only been blind, and now their eyes were forced open. The CEO remained quiet, as if he understood the lesson unfolding without needing to push it further. His silence reinforced mine, and together they became an unspoken verdict. Power no longer sat in the loudest voices or the boldest gestures. It had shifted to the man they tried to silence. And the cruelest part for them was this: I had not demanded it. I had not spoken a word. All I had done was endure, and endurance had outlasted their arrogance. Their strength evaporated in front of me, and I saw it clearly. Respect is not a gift that others bestow at will. It is something that rises, unbroken, even after years of dismissal. In that room, they finally realized what I had always known. You cannot erase a man who has lived with honor. You can only delay the moment when honor reclaims its rightful place. And that moment had come. Justice arrived not in speeches or in raised voices, but in a single moment that no one could undo. I had not lifted a finger, had not raised my tone, had not demanded a hearing. I did not need to. Justice had already entered the room, carried in one word, in one title, in one recognition that no amount of arrogance could erase. Colonel. It echoed still, not as a sound, but as a truth that filled every space between us. And in that truth, justice stood, calm, immovable, undeniable. I sat in silence, and that silence was my verdict. I did not need to argue with men who had betrayed their own gratitude. I did not need to list my years of service, to remind them of sleepless nights or sacrifices that had built the ground beneath their chairs. The word had spoken all of it for me. It was the summary of a life, the weight of years, the witness of scars invisible to them, yet carved into my being. They could not challenge it, because they knew it was not a matter of opinion. It was fact. And facts need no defense. Around the table, their postures betrayed them. The arrogance had drained away, leaving unease in its place. Their hands fumbled with pens, their eyes shifted toward me and quickly away, as if contact might burn them. They had spent so long believing they could rewrite the story, strip me of relevance, bury me in silence. But justice does not require permission. It simply arrives, often when least expected, and leaves no space for denial. That was what I felt now. Not triumph, not revenge, but justice settling into its place like a stone falling into water, creating ripples they could never stop. The young one sat stiff, his earlier smirk now a memory that clung to him like shame he could not wash off. He had called me irrelevant, mocked me as an old man, dismissed me as someone better unseen. But justice had answered him without my voice. It had answered in the CEO's recognition, in the respect that had returned to me without effort, in the silence that condemned him more loudly than any rebuke. He shifted uncomfortably, trapped in the realization that his insult would follow him long after this meeting ended, a reminder of his arrogance laid bare. I looked at them, but I did not gloat. Justice is not about vengeance. It is about balance restored. For too long, the weight had been tipped unfairly, my dignity dismissed, my voice ignored. Now it had corrected itself, not through struggle, but through truth. Justice had walked into the room with steady steps and placed itself at my side. I did not need to hold it. It stood on its own. What struck me most was the stillness that followed. Meetings were usually full of noise, of debates and interruptions, of voices climbing over each other in desperation to be heard. But now, none of that remained. The silence was not empty. It was filled with acknowledgement, with shame, with a respect none of them could deny any longer. The scales had shifted without argument, without fight. I had given nothing, yet I had gained back everything they tried to take. And so I sat there, quiet, steady, watching the justice I had not asked for settle into its place. It did not roar, it did not thunder. It simply stood, undeniable, in the presence of men who could no longer pretend not to see me. Justice had come, and it had come in silence. The meeting resumed, or at least they tried to make it seem that way. Papers shuffled again, voices cleared, numbers were brought back to the surface like lifebuoys in a sinking sea. But something had changed, and every man in that room felt it. Each word they spoke now carried hesitation. Each suggestion was measured more carefully, as if every sentence might brush against me, and they could not afford another wound of arrogance. I did not interrupt, did not interject, but they no longer dared to push me aside. The silence that had once been used to erase me had become the space they could no longer ignore. Every decision bent toward me, whether they admitted it or not. A proposal was made, and I saw their eyes flicker in my direction, searching not for approval in words, but for assurance in presence. A contract was discussed, and though my mouth remained closed, their tone softened, their arguments tempered, as if the gravity of my past was weighing down their pride. It was not my voice that guided them now, but the knowledge of who I was, the unspoken acknowledgement of what I carried. My silence had transformed into a kind of authority no position on their organizational chart could capture. That was the triumph. Not loud, not boastful, not declared with raised fists or victorious speeches. It was quiet, steady, undeniable. A triumph that needed no celebration because it was written in their behavior, etched into the air of the room. They could not erase me anymore because now they remembered too clearly. They remembered the sacrifices they had dismissed, the path they had mocked, the title they had tried to bury. And now they saw it all, reflected in a single word, anchored in their own guilt. I sat as I had before, still, silent, calm, but the difference was in them. The same men who had once thrown glances of irritation at me now avoided my gaze, or worse, sought it cautiously, hoping to find forgiveness I had not offered. Their arrogance had evaporated, leaving something brittle and fragile in its place. Respect, yes, but a respect born not of love or loyalty, but of recognition, the kind that settles heavily when truth finally claws its way through denial. The young one was the most transformed. His voice, which had carried mockery and impatience earlier, was now hushed, uncertain. He shifted in his seat each time he tried to speak, the weight of his earlier insult binding him. He could not erase what he had said, and every time the word colonel echoed in his mind, it must have burned like a brand. He had thought himself above me, but now he struggled to sit at the same table. His triumph had been short, fragile, and now it was mine. Not because I crushed him, but because I no longer needed to. Truth had done it for me, and through it all, I did not seek to reclaim what had been taken. I did not crave revenge or vindication. The triumph was not in their shame. It was in my dignity returning to its rightful place. I had endured the silence they had forced upon me, and that endurance had outlasted their arrogance. My triumph was in not breaking, in not lowering myself to their noise, in sitting through betrayal until respect had no choice but to rise again. The meeting crawled forward, but it no longer belonged to them. Every decision, every number, every plan was overshadowed by the presence they had underestimated. I was not just in the room, I was the weight in the room. They felt it with every breath, with every pause, with every glance they dared to steal. And so, without saying a single word, I had won. Not in the way they measured victories, not in contracts signed or profits counted, but in the quiet restoration of truth. It was the kind of triumph that does not need to be celebrated, because it cannot be undone. That day, as the meeting dragged itself toward its end, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Betrayal can wound deeply. It can strip a man of his seat at the table, exile him to the corner, reduce him to silence, and bury him under layers of arrogance and ingratitude. Betrayal can erase a name from the minutes, erase a voice from the debates, erase presence from the center of a room. But what betrayal cannot erase, what it has no power over, are the years of sacrifice already carved into stone, the legacy of choices made in truth, the dignity that belongs to a man who lived by honor. My seat at the table had been threatened, but my life's worth had never been in danger. Respect is not a gift to be handed out at the whims of others. It is something earned in blood, in sweat, in the quiet endurance of doing what is right when no one applauds. I had earned it long before this company existed, long before these men wore their first ties or signed their first contracts. I had earned it in the mud and the cold, under skies that offered no comfort, carrying men who trusted me with their lives. That respect was mine, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. And in one word, Colonel, it returned, sudden, undeniable even to those who had once conspired to bury it. I watched them, each one struggling to hold himself together under the weight of that realization. Their arrogance had not simply vanished. It had been revealed for what it truly was: fragile, paper-thin, cowardly. They could not meet my eyes because meeting them meant admitting what they had done, what they had tried to erase, what they had denied for so long. They had told themselves a story where I was no longer needed, where I was a relic fading away. But that story cracked, and through the cracks came the truth. You cannot bury a life lived with honor. You cannot silence a man whose silence carries history. The CEO did not need to say more. He had spoken my title, and with that the judgment had been passed. He moved the meeting forward as though nothing monumental had occurred, but every one of us knew that everything had changed. From that moment on, no one could speak in that room without remembering the word that had leveled the ground beneath them. No one could suggest I was irrelevant without hearing their own hypocrisy echo back. I sat quietly, and in that quiet, I found peace. Not triumph in the way men often think of triumph, not in humiliation of others, not in the crumbling of enemies, but in something pure. My peace was in knowing that dignity, once earned, never dies. It may be buried under betrayal, suffocated by arrogance, ignored by those who prefer convenience over truth. But dignity is patient. It waits. And when the right moment comes, it rises again, sometimes in the simplest of ways, sometimes in just a single word. That day I walked out of the room not as a man restored by others, but as a man who had never truly lost himself. Betrayal had tried to write me out of the story, but history had written me in ink, not pencil. Their memory may falter, but my legacy was not theirs to erase. And the greatest justice was this: I did not have to fight for respect. I only had to endure long enough for it to return. Respect, once earned through honor, always finds its way back. Sometimes it returns through applause, sometimes through silence, sometimes through the trembling of those who once sneered. And sometimes, as it did for me, it returns in one word, spoken at the right moment, carrying the weight of a lifetime. That word was my legacy. Not the profits, not the contracts, not the arguments or the titles on paper. My legacy was respect, built in places where survival had meant more than numbers, where trust had been sacred, where silence had been a language stronger than any speech. That day, in a boardroom filled with men who had forgotten, respect returned, and with it dignity, justice, and the reminder that betrayal can wound, but it cannot erase the truth of a life lived with honor.